So Padmasambhava, who is a historical figure, but there's also a lot of legends and myth based around this man. He's written and spoken about in both mythological and historical terms, and sometimes it's hard to tell where one starts and the other finishes. I'll just run through his mythical birth, which you'd say is pure Mahayana or Vajrayana, which is what part of his tradition is, which is very, very, I don't know what you would say, fantastical. Might seem quite fantastical to people who aren't used to hearing these kinds of stories. So his story begins in a purely spiritual world, a purely transcendental world, the world of the Buddha Amitabha, who is in principle the chief Buddha of the Nyingma tradition, which was established by Padmasambhava. Amitabha means infinite light, so Amitabha is the Buddha of infinite light. And so Amitabha was seated in profound meditation, and then from his tongue a ray of pure red light travelled down and hit a lake in Tibet. And flew down and hit the earth and penetrated the centre of a lake in northwest India. And there rose a small island covered in golden grass. From it, springs of pure turquoise water sprang. And in the centre of the island bloomed an enormous lotus blossom. And then the Buddha of infinite light emitted from his heart a golden five-pointed Vajra, which fell to the centre of the lotus blossom. When people later came, they found a small boy of about 8 years old seated in the lotus centre. He looked, as legend tells us, just like an infant Buddha. In his right hand, a tiny lotus blossom, in his left hand, a tiny vase of a kind used for tantric initiations. And in the crook of his left arm, a tiny trident, and this was Padmasambhava, the Lotus Born. The name Padmasambhava means Lotus Born, one born from a lotus. So that is his mythic birth, but he was also an historical figure. He was born in northwestern India in the kingdom of Udayana. Udayana was at that time a very great and famous centre of tantric practice, tantric ritual, and tantric meditation, especially esoteric meditation. Tantric, I should probably explain what tantric means, because I'm using that word a lot. It will get explained later, but I'll say tantric it's more intuitive based and sort of mantras and pujas, and it actually means sort of interwoven, but it's not so much intellectual and purely intellectual. I'll leave it as that. And esoteric means not very, quite detailed and in depth and quite advanced. So when you hear about esoteric practitioners, they've been doing it a long time, and they're moving into very subtle points about the Dharma. Padmasambhava as a boy was adopted by the king of Udayana, whose name was Indrabhuti. Indrabhuti himself was also a great Buddhist scholar and yogi. And a yogi, if somebody are wondering, which we'll use this word a few times, is somebody who's a bit like us actually. They're more lay. They're not monks. They're practitioners, and they will have long hair and not shaven heads. And they're serious practitioners, and they can have wives and children. And like the king, for instance, he was a yogi, so he takes the Dharma to the same seriousness as the monk would, but doesn't live in a monastery. That's one way to explain it. And the Padmasambhava as a young man was educated as a young prince, and eventually he was married to the daughter of a neighbouring king. but his innate spiritual nature compelled him to leave home and become a monk. And so he travelled around northern and eastern India and Central Asia. He also likely visited Sumatra and Java, so he was widely travelled. Above all, he spent a lot of time meditating in cremation grounds, which used to be something which went on back then. A lot of people would meditate in cremation grounds where people get burnt when they're dead. And these are big areas of lots of bodies and different levels of decay and disintegration. And the high attainment practitioners, the esoteric Buddhists, would go there because they believed they could get higher levels of insight into the nature of the universe. So he was very into that. After many years, he returned home and immediately got into serious trouble, as his spiritual companion, that is to say non-romantic, was a yogini or a darkini called Mandarava. Now there was nothing going on, but the good people of Udayana thought otherwise, and so the yogi and yogini were both sentenced to be burnt at the stake. However, thankfully for this story, they has managed to escape and continue their travels. Padmasambhava then went to Bodh Gaya, where, of course, the Buddha, 70 centuries earlier, had gained enlightenment. And his reputation as a spiritual genius grew even further. From here, he was invited to Tibet by its king. So, this is probably the part which Padmasambhava is most famous for. Padmasambhava's visit to Tibet and the taming of the gods of Tibet. At the time of Padmasambhava's visit, Buddhism had been known in Tibet for only about 100 years, as long as Buddhism had been known in the West nowadays. And it was by no means established, as a few temples had been built, a few Buddhist scriptures had been translated, but that was all. So there were temples, but there weren't any monasteries, so no Tibetan monks and no nuns. The time, however, was ripe, and the new king was very strongly drawn to Buddhism. So he invited the great Indian teacher and scholar Shankaracharya, head monk of Nandava, the great university centre of the times. And Shankaracharya taught in the king's palace for 4 months without interruption, every day teaching not only the king, but also courtiers and other interested people. He taught mainly 3 things on this occasion. He taught the 10 precepts, 10 ethical precepts, the 10 dhatus, or also known as the components of perception, or senses, and thirdly, the 12 nidanas, or links, the 12 successive stages of birth, death, and rebirth. In other words, Shankaracharya gave the king and other interested Tibetans an elementary course in Buddhism, Buddhist ethics, Buddhist psychology, and Buddhist metaphysics. Apparently, however, he said nothing about meditation or anything about symbolic ritual. He didn't tell Tibetans any parables or stories or legends or anything of that sort. In other words, Shankaracharya's approach was exclusively intellectual and rational. So what was the result of this introduction to Buddhism in Tibet? Well, the result was that the gods of Tibet became very angry. One of the king's palaces was struck by lightning. Another was swept away by a flood. The harvest was badly damaged and was a great epidemic. So terrible, in fact, was the reaction from the gods that Shankaracharya had to leave Tibet. Well, before he left, though, he told the king that the situation was beyond him, but that all was not lost, as there was a great spiritual master called Padmasambhava. He will be able to overcome the gods of Tibet, he assured the king. So it was that Padmasambhava was invited to Tibet. This was around the year 700 CE. Padmasambhava, like Shantarashita, set to work with determination, but in a different way. Padmasambhava did not give any discourses, he just devoted himself to overcoming the gods and goddesses of Tibet. And not only did he overcome the gods and goddesses of Tibet, he converted them to Buddhism, and he entrusted them to protect the Dharma in Tibet. Shantarashita, now that the coast was clear, returned and with help of the king, a great monastery was built in the southwest Tibet called Samye. The consecration ceremony was performed jointly by Shantarashita and Padmasambhava. The rational and the intuitive aspects of Buddhism combining. So how did Padmasambhava achieve the integration of the gods and spirits into Buddhism, and so establish Buddhism in Tibet? Let's take a closer look at Shantarashita's teachings, because it is this which upset the gods of Tibet so much. Shantarashita as a man was very straight, intellectual and rational. His teachings were so exclusively intellectual and rational. His also were exclusively so. And his character trait, well, had got him the job in the first place. As the more esoteric, that word again, characters of the time were too strange for the Tibetan court. A question he was asked at his job interview was, "What is your doctrine?" And Shantarashita replied, "My doctrine is to follow whatever is proved and correct, and after examining it by reason, and to avoid all that does not agree with reason." So perhaps we can begin to see why the gods of Tibet were so displeased. It's as though they weren't so much displeased with Buddhism itself. They were displeased, as it were, with Shantarashita's rather one-sidedly rational approach. Which you might ask, why were they not happy with rational approach? A further question one could ask, who or what were the gods of Tibet? What did they represent? Well, one could say they represented all the non-rational forces of the Tibetan psyche. Or, if you like, the forces of the Tibetan subconscious. And these forces were, as it were, threatened, even repressed by Shantarashita's rationalism. So the gods got angry. They created havoc in national life. They insisted on being recognised. They demanded to be recognised. So Padmasambhava was called in. Like Shantarashita, Padmasambhava was a great scholar. He was an intellectual. He knew all the texts, scriptures, the philosophy. But his overall approach was not intellectual. He was much more than a scholar. He was much more than an intellectual. He was a supreme yogi. He is a meditator. He is a master of the occult arts and the occult sciences. Dakini, he spent much time in the cremation grounds. He spent much time there with the Dakinis, whom we may say very roughly are the sort of Buddhist equivalent of Tibetan gods and goddesses. They are, as it were, forces of inspiration which rise in the depths of the enlightened mind. They fly through the sky of the Absolute, the Dharma Dhatu, the deep blue sky of potentiality. His experience is not just, as it were, intellectual. We may say he is a master of these forces. So whereas Shantarashita does not even acknowledge the gods of Tibet, Padmasambhava begins by recognizing the gods. He sees them, they are met by him. Padmasambhava acknowledges those irrational, non-rational, even sometimes supra-rational forces of the Tibetan psyche. And he integrates them into the great current of the spiritual life of Tibetan Buddhism. He harnesses their energy. He doesn't go against them. He carries them along with him. So Shantarashita, the intellectual, and Padmasambhava, the yogi, together build and consecrate Samye, the great monastery. There is no antagonism, as it were, between the two approaches, the rational and the non-rational. They are both necessary, they are both complementary. Sangha-Rachita and Padmasambhava each recognise the greatness of each other. It's clear that it is not enough to appeal just to the rational mind, one must appeal to the unconscious depths. It is not enough to think and reflect, one must feel, one must respond with one's whole being. So Padmasambhava is important as he is a tantric teacher. Tantric practices are numerous, but include working with sound, through mantra, sacred words and phrases, with gesture through mudra, ritualized sacred hand gestures, with sight through visualization and mandalas, diagrams of the universe, and with vital energies through meditation and yoga, through the creative arts. This is Padmasambhava conquering the gods. I will talk briefly about my own responses to this throughout my Buddhist time. On the personal level, he teaches me to listen subtly to the world, not to prejudge things, and to let things come into focus through mindfulness, and bring into clarity, and the truth can be revealed. Finding truth through other means of intellect encourages me to put down the burden of the rational, the concrete, not only responding to the obvious or the one-dimensional. It appears that Western society has lost contact with its spirits. We can make contact with a sense of how can we make contact with a sense that the universe is alive? When we're conditioned to believe that inert dead matter produces a myriad of forms, and when the big enough computer is made, everything will be explained in reductionist, atomized principles and constructs. When a long time ago, when I went to retreats in New Zealand, there's a big retreat centre there called Sudarshana, and it was training to become an alderman, which is what this means. And one of the first things somebody said there, Ratnavura, he said he was talking about planting a Bodhi tree on the site. It was in a big mythical place. There's these huge mountains, and they run down to the sea, and there's a big stupa there. It's quite an amazing place. And he was asking the spirits permission to plant a Bodhi tree, because a Bodhi tree is not indigenous to New Zealand. So he was asking permission, and I remember going, "Oh, what's he talking about? The spirits?" And I sort of had this because a lot of my understanding had been quite intellectual, so the idea that there were spirits to ask permission from, and that it was okay, was quite strange to me. But as the retreat progressed, I sort of held that in my mind, and I sort of was looking around and was thinking about all the trees and the birds and everything, and it was like there was always consciousnesses. This is something also what I've learned to develop. These consciousnesses, they seem to combine to make a spirit of a place. This is one way of looking at it, but it was sort of loosening my Western secular ideas about there just being, just, I don't know what now I'm a bit confused as to exactly what people do think, but they think that there isn't really anything there apart from what we see. The universe is only apparent to what has been explained to us, and that is all that we can really understand. And now I have more of a sense that there is more going on here. There's us all sitting in this room with our own personal consciousnesses, but there is a consciousness being created by us, and there is a spirit, and we can't possibly we can't actually see a spirit in here, but there is a hot consciousness happening in this room between us all, and this is happening all around, and there's a dynamic of all of our consciousnesses combining and producing spirit. This is a rather badly explained sort of sense, which I've now sort of developed from a more secular point of view. I think Buddhism appeals to a lot of people. I've noticed in that it is quite. It has, when you first hear of mindfulness and conditioned co-production, which is about, it's like cause and effect. People, Westerners, come in with their scientific secular views, a lot of people, and they sort of, that appeals to them, but it's quite rational about how we go about with our practice of just trying to perceive what is here in the scene and not trying to make stories up about it. It is quite it's sort of almost, that is quite a rational thing. But what seems to come out of this rational, or not making stories up and just being with the scene and the heard and the smelt and the felt, is that we seem to join in with a higher level of consciousness beyond these things. And I think that it takes a while for us as Westerners to sort of tune into that. And there's all Padmasambhava, he represents that ability to get yourself out of the way, sort of, if you bust. That, you know, I remember seeing somebody bow down to the shrine for the first time when I first came here, and I was like, oh my God, somebody's bowing down to the shrine. But I used to be a Catholic, and I didn't like it very much, and I was sort of, you know, liked all that. All that sort of ritual stuff, I just found it terrible. But I suddenly saw this person bowing down, and I was a bit slightly taken aback. But then I realised that no, it's about giving yourself up. It's about getting yourself out of the way. And you know, these mantras and all these other things which are about body and breathing and sound, they help dissolve the ego and help you get into this higher space of realization, which the intellect alone can't get there. You just can't do it. You can't just break everything down and understand everything in the world through your intellect. It's just not going to happen. You know, you start banging it against the wall. You have to try other ways of interweaving yourself into the universe through other practices. I mean, a lot of people I know talk about you know, how their connection to nature, or going for a walk, could be seen as a tantric practice. Or I mean, and this is what I'd like to say. We're in the discussion groups now, but maybe we can talk about, some people might be naturally very intuitive, and other people might be more intellectual. So maybe we can ask ourselves that question: what are we? How do we see Buddhism? Do we see it as an intellectual practice or an intuitive practice? And just generally, how do you respond to, and how do you find your way in on that level? What is your tantric? Because, you know, for a creative process yourself, how do you get some kind of tantric thing going for yourself to get yourself out of that intellectual approach and into a more embodied, intuitive sense? Yeah. So I think I'll draw a line on the bit there. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.